Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm with the Scholar. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're happy you're here and we hope you enjoy tonight's program. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping as always. One, please take an events flyer as you leave and stay tuned to our social media pages, website, and e-newsletter for announcements and updates on new events. And we hope to see you at a future event. Lastly, we encourage you to come away with a signed book this evening. Richard and Leah are sticking around to sign copies of Just Action, and you can have it personalized if you'd like. Book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our free author events, and they help support the bookstore, our staff, and our authors. We'll have copies of Just Action and The Color of Law for sale up at the cafe during and after the event. But now I'm happy to introduce our speakers here this evening. Born and raised in Lancaster, Ismail Smith-Wade L. graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with degrees in anthropology and theater. Prior to his election to the PA House of Representatives, Representative Smith-Wade L. served on Lancaster City Council for 5 years, serving as president of council for the last 2. Passionate about issues of housing access and affordability, Izzy has worked in the nonprofit anti-poverty sector for almost a decade, most recently as a specialist for the Lancaster County Homelessness Coalition. In his short time in the House, is he has organized with other legislators to turn his community's shared values into reality, such as passing the Fairness Act out of the PA House, and continues to fight for racial justice, workers' rights, and a fully funded education for every student in the Commonwealth. Of course, our featured authors here this evening. Richard Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, which has been called the most forceful argument ever published on how federal, state, and local governments gave rise to the reinforced neighborhood segregation. He is a father to co-author Leah Rothstein and has written many books and articles on educational policy and racial inequality. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Leah Rothstein's expertise is in the full range of housing policy, stems from more than 2 decades of experience as a consultant to affordable housing developers and local governments, and as a community and union organizer. She also lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Of course, the new book that we are here for this evening is titled Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. While The Color of Law brilliantly recounted how government at all levels created segregation, Just Action describes how we can begin to undo it. Lisa Rice, the president of the National Fair Housing Alliance, says that Just Action is the book America needs for this moment, end quote. We're so honored to welcome Richard, Leah, and Representative Smith-Waite-El to Harrisburg. So without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I'm a call and response kind of person, but I'll only make you do that just the once. So obviously we're here to talk about just action, and we're going to jump into that in just a moment. But unfortunately, Alex has made the unwise choice to hand a politician a microphone. So you'll bear with me as I say that this is absolutely the book for this moment. Housing is at a crisis point across the Commonwealth and across the nation. It is the most important, least talked about political issue, and it is one that affects all of our communities, urban, suburban, and rural, red and blue states. So I'm really excited to be here with the co-authors of Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. So my first question actually is for those of you who are here this evening. Who has had the fortune to read The Color of Law? Okay, great. Love that. Where we're going to start is, if you would, because this book is recommendations moving forward from that book. And I know that a lot of folks read The Color of Law and said, wow, I didn't know it was that bad, or I didn't know the roots went that deep. But before we can move forward, I think it's important to go back to the beginning. Richard, would you please just ground us in The Color of Law as a text?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks all of you for coming to hear us this evening. The Color of Law was a book that demolished a widespread myth that we have de facto segregation in this country, something that just happened by accident because blacks and whites like to live with each other of the same race, or private businesses discriminated, or individuals discriminated in how they sold or rented housing. That turns out is, as I say, an utter myth with no reality to it whatsoever. The reason we have a segregated society in every metropolitan area of this country, blacks living in clearly defined neighborhoods, whites living in clearly defined neighborhoods, is because of unconstitutional, racially explicit policies at the federal, state, and local level that required us to be an apartheid society. The Color of Law describes many, many policies that the federal government followed, that state and local governments followed, all racially explicit, not the unintended consequence of race-neutral policies, but racially explicit policies prohibiting African Americans and whites from living in the same neighborhoods. Those policies were so powerful that they continue to determine, to a large extent, the racial inequality that we have in this country, not only in housing, but in all the things that stem from living in different neighborhoods. Very briefly, the most powerful policy that the federal government followed to create segregation in this country was to suburbanize the white working class and lower middle class population into single family homes in all white suburbs from which African Americans were prohibited by federal policy from moving into. Those suburbs then appreciated in value over the next few generations. The whites who were subsidized by the federal government to purchase those homes gained wealth from the appreciation of the value of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college, to take care of temporary emergencies, to finance their retirements, and to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this policy that turned out to be a wealth generating policy. The result is that today, although African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth, and that enormous disparity is entirely attributable to unconstitutional, unlawful federal policy that starts with housing, but that underlies much of the racial inequality that we have today. So that was the argument of The Color of Law.
Thank you. So Just Action is a book which, as I mentioned, contains a number of detailed recommendations for legislators, for community organizers, activists, advocates, and just regular people who don't necessarily want to attach a label to their identity. But I will say, and this question is directed to you, Leah, as a legislator reading this, it's rare to see a book with such detailed recommendations. And I want to give you a compliment because the book specifically calls out not just the recommendations for advocates to push, but at what level they might push each one. And I'm sure that that comes from your experience. Can you talk about how you went about including these recommendations and why it was so important to be so specific?
Sure. So as we all know, in 2020, our country went through a racial reckoning following George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. And after that, 20 million Americans across the country marched in Black Lives Matter protests. 20 million, more than any other time in our history, the number of people marching for racial equality. They were Black and white, urban and suburban, young and old. They were all over the country. And this was a huge movement. It seemed like a new day was dawning. But then most people went home from these protests and marches and put Black Lives Matter signs on their front lawns, maybe started a book club. Their companies maybe issued letters to their shareholders denouncing their racist policies and promising to do better. But nothing changed, and nobody started movements in their own communities to advocate for changing the racially segregated way that we live in communities all across the country. And we think part of the reason for that is because we didn't know what to do. Most people don't know what to do. Segregation is an overwhelming problem. I mean, the whole book of Color of Law was detail after detail of all of the policies that went into creating it. And to look at that and think, how are we going to undo this? It can feel impossible. So we wanted to give people some ideas of what can do, because it's actually not impossible to do something about this. And we understand that to redress segregation, to really challenge the racial makeup of how we live in our communities today, it will take federal interventions eventually. But we also aren't naive, and we know that there isn't the federal political will to make national change. But that political will can be built locally in our own communities. And the fact is that a lot of policies and programs and strategies that go into maintaining and perpetuating segregation are under local control. And so if we got together locally and formed groups with our neighbors and with other residents in our communities and started to address these issues and started to tackle them one at a time, there's, just as there were so many pieces that went into creating segregation, there's a lot of pieces that go into undoing it. And we can just start one by one in our own communities. So we really focused on the local level, and we wanted to give people real tools for what kind of change they could support and start advocating for.
I'm going to follow up with you, Leah, and then bounce over to Richard. On the subject of some of the examples you include in the book of really sort of grassroots observational organizing work, what's a map twin?
I was hoping you'd ask about that. I love this example. So we start out the book saying that to start working on these issues, we need to build a new activated civil rights movement around the country. And to do that, we need to build local committees, like I mentioned, like we need groups in our own communities of our neighbors, and those should be biracial and multi-ethnic. And we understand that that can be daunting because we live in such racially segregated communities. We have little contact with people of other races in general, less than previous generations because we live in these segregated communities. So outside of the workplace, we have little social contact across races. So we gave some examples of communities that had addressed that obstacle and brought people together across from different race parts of town. So one example is from Chicago. A really amazing artist there, a photographer named Tanika Johnson. She took the unique layout of Chicago, which is built on an exact grid, and folded the map of Chicago in half so that the houses on the north side sat exactly on top of houses on the south side of the same street. One was in the white side of town, one in the African-American side of town, and named the houses that fell on top of each other map twins. And she took pictures of the two houses and did an art exhibit showing the different neighborhood conditions of these map twin houses. And then she contacted the residents of the houses and asked them if they wanted to meet their map twin. And a lot of them said yes. And they started to meet each other. They gave their map twin a tour of their neighborhood. And these are people who, many of them lived in Chicago their whole lives and had never been to the south side if they lived on the north side, had never been to the north side if they lived on the south side. And they learned a lot about each other. They learned they had a lot in common, but their neighborhoods looked very different. And so this like grew, and they ended up developing block twins. You messed me up on that one. Block twins, where they built, the twins of the blocks, and they got together and formed bigger groups, and they did some beautification efforts. Now, this was all started from an art project. So the next step in this project would be for an organizer to help these groups start to think about what they could do to address the conditions of segregation in Chicago. But that's an example of a way we can start bringing people together across racial lines in our communities to start talking and building connections.
On the subject of bringing people together across racial lines, Richard, isn't this book a little bit too woke? I mean, really, really genuinely, you make recommendations in this book, and you specifically say that these efforts should be race conscious. They should not be race neutral, but take on matters of race directly. And I think by and large, as Americans, we're very much in a mode where we try to do things in a race neutral way. So tell me, why should we do things in a way that specifically advantages Black Americans or other groups?
Race, whoops, is this still on? Yeah, okay, yeah. Race-specific crimes require race-specific remedies. You can't do it any other way. There is no, we have many, many race-neutral policies today that reinforce segregation, reinforce racial segregation, not racially explicit anymore. You don't need to. When you have two different communities, the different population characteristics, the same policy, no matter how neutral it is in its face, is going to have different impacts on those different communities. And we talk about many of these. For example, in most cities in this country, I actually don't know about Harrisburg, but it's probably true because the exceptions are very, very few. African-American homeowners pay property taxes at a higher rate than white homeowners. They pay property tax at a higher rate than white homeowners, is because tax assessors, many reasons, tax assessors don't go into homes to create assessments. They look at the outsides of homes. The outsides of homes in white and Black neighborhoods are more similar than the insides of homes. The insides of homes in white neighborhoods are likely to have more amenities, more finishing, more up-to-date appliances. So they're worth more. That means that the assessed value of homes in Black neighborhoods are closer to their market values than the assessed values of homes in white neighborhoods, which are farther below their market values. The result is that African Americans pay property taxes at a higher rate relative to the value of their homes than whites do. What we say is that people in these neighborhoods who have been paying excess taxes deserve refunds from the public treasury for the excess taxes that they've paid. The only way they're going to get those is with a civil rights movement that organizes and begins to meet with people and create the popular base for that kind of remedy. Another example would be home ownership itself. African Americans, as I described a minute ago, in reference to the federal policies that suburbanized the country, African Americans were excluded from these homes. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that said, okay, African Americans, you can now move into these suburban homes. We're not going to stop you anymore, the federal government. But the homes are now unaffordable. They weren't unaffordable when they were created. Blacks and whites both could have afforded homes in the 1950s in those suburbs that were created. Today, they're unaffordable. We need subsidies for African Americans, not for others, for African Americans to buy homes from which they exclusively were excluded, specifically excluded when those developments were created. The Supreme Court, let me just say, I'll promote something else, if you don't mind.
Go for it, Rich.
The Supreme Court is about to issue a decision that everybody expects to prohibit colleges and universities from using affirmative action to try to increase African-American enrollment. And 2 days ago, or I guess it's 3 days ago now, I published an article in The Atlantic calling on college presidents to defy the Supreme Court and continue affirmative action anyway, even if the Supreme Court prohibits it. And the way they should do it is doing something that civil rights advocates and litigators have not done. And is stop justifying affirmative action on the basis of diversity, as though the reason we need Black students in colleges is to make white students better educated. The reason we need affirmative action is as a remedy for the unconstitutional policies that were created and that left African Americans in a disadvantageous position for the reasons I described before than whites are. And that kind of rationale, that kind of constitutional justification has not been used by civil rights litigators. It should be, but we've been sucked into this diversity notion and forgotten the reason for affirmative action is as remedy for unconstitutional policy. And I hope that we'll find college presidents, maybe the University of Pennsylvania, who knows, or Penn State University, I'm sorry, Penn State University, will have the courage to persist in affirmative action, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, which is totally without constitutional basis.
I'm going to follow up with you, Richard, because you just offered a pretty bold instruction, which is to defy the Supreme Court. Is this something with a lot of historical precedent since we're talking about it?
Well, yes, the best precedent is, maybe you've heard of this, the Dred Scott decision. In 1857, the Supreme Court, and by the way, there's a chapter of the book which describes 150 years of unconstitutional Supreme Court policy designed to keep African Americans in a subjugated position. But one of the worst cases was in 1857, a decision called Dred Scott prohibited African Americans from being citizens in any state, even free African Americans. They weren't talking about enslaved people. Prohibited them from having any citizenship rights, and prohibited states that were free states from accepting formerly enslaved people as free people. It was a blatantly unconstitutional decision. The African Americans not only had been citizens since the beginning of the country in states where they were free, even North Carolina, they had voted in elections to ratify the Constitution. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court said that they had no right to be citizens. Well, Abraham Lincoln, who was beginning the formation of the Republican Party at that time, said that Americans should defy the Supreme Court, should not obey that ruling. And Republican states at that time followed the Supreme Court ruling almost immediately with laws that defied it. New York State, for example, had allowed African Americans to vote, free African Americans to vote in New York, but African Americans in New York at the time had a higher property qualification than whites had. They had to own more property than whites had to own in order to be qualified to vote. In the wake of the Supreme Court decision, the New York State Legislature passed a law abolishing the discriminatory property requirement, just as a way of sticking it to the Supreme Court. And Lincoln's view was that over time, if case after case came up where the citizens defied the Supreme Court, over time there would be more dissenting opinions against the Supreme Court's ruling, more lower court decisions that provided the basis, and the Supreme Court eventually would have to cave in and do it. Of course, he didn't anticipate the Civil War at that time. But this is not the, my call is not a woke call. It's something rooted in 160 years of American history.
And indeed the origins of the Republican Party. I'm just going to take that one as a freebie for myself. I'll I'll remind both of the authors that just because it is a little warm under here under the lights, there are waters down the side of each of the chairs, so we're aware. Don't want anybody to faint up here. So I'll make this a little bit personal for me, and actually one of my former colleagues is in the audience. I used to work for the Lancaster County Homelessness Coalition, which was a part of the Lancaster County Housing and Redevelopment Authority, which among other things assigns housing choice or Section 8 vouchers to families across Lancaster County. And one of the most galling things I discovered while working in the sector of services for the unhoused is from time to time, someone would receive a housing voucher, and then a couple of months later, they'd come to us and say they hadn't found anything, and then their voucher would expire and it would be useless. So this is a big open-ended question, but where did we go so astray on housing choice vouchers, and what policies do we need to actually make that subsidy, really that guarantee, what it's supposed to be?
Yeah, so Section 8 housing choice vouchers are funded by the federal government, but administered by local public housing agencies. So the federal government decides how much each locality gets, but then the locality decides how to administer the program. The Section 8 program had the promise and the intention when it was created to allow low-income families the opportunity to move out of high poverty areas if they desired, because the voucher was mobile. You could use the voucher to rent a unit anywhere in the jurisdiction of your housing authority. But only 5% of voucher holders, and white voucher holders are more likely to do this than African-American voucher holders, only 5% can use their voucher to live in what are called high opportunity areas or neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods with well-resourced schools, access to public space, jobs, transportation. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is discrimination. The federal government has not outlawed discrimination against voucher holders. So it is legal to the federal government for a landlord to say, I just won't rent to you because you use Section 8 to pay your rent. There's many states and localities around the country who've outlawed that with source of income discrimination laws. I know there's some efforts to do that here. But even in places with these laws in effect, Section 8 voucher holders face discrimination, even though it's illegal in a lot of places. And that's because there needs to be enforcement and monitoring, and that falls often on fair housing organizations, which are underfunded, rely on volunteers to be testers to find out when landlords are discriminating. So that's a suggestion we provide in Just Action, that people concerned about this issue could volunteer with their fair housing organization locally to be a tester to try to root out where discrimination is occurring. So that's discrimination. That's just one part of the puzzle. So that's a big part of why a voucher tenant gets 60 days to find a unit. And then even if it took them years on the waiting list to get the voucher, after 60 days, it expires if they can't find a unit. And if landlords are saying they just flat out won't rent to voucher holders, how are they going to find a unit in 60 days, especially in the housing market as it is right now? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is how the voucher amount itself is calculated. So the voucher amount is the maximum amount that the voucher will support. So a tenant, the voucher holder pays 30% of their income towards their rent, no matter what their income is. And then the voucher makes up the difference up to that maximum amount. And the maximum amount is set at 40% of the median of the entire metropolitan area's rents. So you take a large metropolitan area, the lowest rent to the highest rent, you take the one in the middle, go 10% below that, and that's the maximum rent a voucher will pay. So by definition, over 50% of the rents in the metropolitan region are out of a voucher's holder's reach because they're too expensive. So those are obviously, in the higher cost, higher opportunity areas of the region. So this is another piece that's under local control. So now the federal government, HUD, requires some agencies around the country to use a smaller area to determine their maximum rent amount, so that in higher cost areas of a region, maximum voucher amount is higher than in lower cost areas. But where it isn't required, a local housing authority can voluntarily adopt this small area rent standard. That's completely up to the control of the local housing authority. We just talked to one in Central California that decided to adopt this region-wide voluntarily. And so when they do that, that allows voucher holders access to more units throughout the whole region. So that can open up their opportunity not only to leave high poverty areas, but just to have access to more units that are available in their region. So these are a couple of examples, ways that the voucher program has failed in its promise to provide mobility opportunities for voucher holders to leave high poverty areas, and ways that we can address that locally and start to provide some fixes.
So when we talk about housing, Leah, one of the things that we very frequently hear is that what we need to do is move Black and brown households into home ownership. That this is sort of the silver bullet, the stroke of lightning that's going to address the racial wealth gap. So really, I want you to respond to that, but also I would love for you to talk about the ability for a housing choice voucher to be used to access home ownership, because I think that's something that not a lot of folks know about.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That is another piece of the voucher program that has huge potential. So the local public housing authority can decide to allow some of their vouchers to be used for home ownership, which works the same way as a rental. The voucher holder pays 30% of their monthly income towards their mortgage, and the voucher makes up the difference. And it can get low-income families into home ownership. And it's a great program. It's usually coupled with a savings support program, so the family can save some money before transitioning into home ownership. Very few housing authorities across the country use this program. It's difficult administratively for them to train their staff to learn about home ownership rather than rental markets, but it's not impossible, and some are doing it, and it's a great success. So that's one part of the answer. Now we say in Just Action, we argue that home ownership is an important piece. Like I said, this is a puzzle that involves a lot of pieces to start to undo it. And so home ownership is an important piece, increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans, but it isn't the magic bullet. It's not a panacea. It won't close the wealth gap on its own. And that is because one reason is that homes in African American communities appreciate a lot slower than homes in white communities. African American communities are less well-resourced. There's a whole host of reasons behind this. They're overtaxed. There's a lot of reasons why owning a home for an African American family isn't the same sort of bullet into wealth building as it is for whites. Also, partly home ownership for whites, who were allowed into home ownership when it was subsidized by the federal government and affordable to all families, when African Americans were prohibited from it. And now home ownership is a lot less affordable for everybody. So it's just a lot less of a magic pill to build wealth for African Americans than we would hope it to be. Nonetheless, it is an effective and important strategy for African Americans who want to own homes. They should be able to, and they can build some wealth for sure in doing that. And there's a lot of ways that we can open up opportunities for that. And down payment assistance or subsidies, reforming the credit scoring system, homeownership counseling and education. There's a lot of examples of ways to help open up the barriers or drop the barriers to African Americans getting into home ownership.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. I don't want to leave a misimpression here. This book is not about what Izzy can do. This book is about what people like you can do to force Izzy to do the right thing.
It's true.
And that's the audience for this book. When he said that this book is very detailed, it's detailed only to the extent that describes many, many, many different types of activities that people can do to begin the process of redressing segregation. Leah's referred to a number of them. So it's detailed in that way. It's not detailed into going into specialists' language about any of these policies. It's a book written for people like you. And once you, if you do, become map twins or otherwise form committees to reinvigorate a new activist civil rights movement, excuse me, that's the time to get into the details of specific policies. But what we're trying to do is show that there are so many things that can be done to begin the process of redressing segregation. Doesn't matter where you start, so long as you start somewhere. And that's the kind of, that's the sense in which it's a detailed book.
Real briefly, y'all, and I'm going somewhere with this. If you're a comic book fan, don't take the bait. Who is Wade Wilson?
Wade Wilson is one of the map twins, and you're referring to. So we have a quote from Wade Wilson. He's one of the map twins that I talked about. And he said, and we quote him in the book, that, you know, Tanika Johnson offered them this opportunity to meet their map twins and develop these really meaningful relationships that all of the map twins have developed and sustained over a number of years. And he was talking about how great it's been that Tanika gave them the opportunity by providing this map twin project, but that anybody could do it. And so he said, all you have to do is just do it.
I'm actually gonna read from the quote, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
You've got to sometimes take the initiative and do the uncomfortable thing. I mean, obviously we didn't have to do that because Tanika Johnson, did it for us, and we're very grateful for that. But I would encourage anyone who wants to help bridge the gap that we all know is there, that you should just do it. There are many opportunities, many events, and I would say just get involved. As we're coming to a close here, you name the opening chapter of the book, You Should Just Do It, from this quote. Why?
Well, because we can't pursue any of the policies that we've talked about unless we begin to form the kinds of committees at a local level, grassroots committees, that can begin to put pressure for policy change, take direct action for policy change. I mean, Leah, I don't know how many of you understood what she was saying when she talked about testers. One of the ways to root out discrimination is for a fair housing center to send out Blacks and whites with similar qualifications, either to try to buy a home or rent a home, and see if they are treated differently. One of the issues with that we referred to a few minutes ago is discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. More often than not, if a landlord says he won't rent to a Section 8 voucher holder, that's really just a pretext for not renting to African Americans. And if a Section 8 voucher holder is turned down because of this permission to refuse to rent to Section 8 voucher holders, a fair housing center should send Black and white testers to those landlords and see if they rent only to the white tester who doesn't have a Section 8 voucher holder, or to a Black tester who doesn't have a Section 8 voucher holder. Well, those fair housing centers are starved for funds. Those 20 million people who came out for Black Lives Matter, they might not be organizers, they might not be activists, but they could volunteer to be as testers. They could contribute funds to enable those fair housing centers to operate these kinds of testing programs. So there's so much that people can do if they get together and form activist committees, concerned committees to do this. Leah described the map twins, how it took advantage of this unique geography in Chicago. You could fold the map in half and find almost identical houses on the Black and white side of the city. But once her project became publicized, The Chicago Bungalow Association adopted the program. It wasn't based on this kind of geographic quirk. They just matched up bungalow owners. It's a characteristic Chicago architecture. Bungalow owners in both the black and white side of towns, and said, would you like to meet a map twin in that way? So you don't need that gimmick to do it. We talk a bit about, there's a cliche almost that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in American society. We talk about Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where there were 6 Presbyterian churches. 3 were all white, 3 were all black. They had nothing to do with each other. They didn't even know each other. The ministers of those churches got together and formed something they called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue. It started for a few years just holding socials and picnics and other ways that people could get to know each other. They were required to host opposite race Presbyterians in their own homes. But eventually that group grew to force the city council to adopt the Civilian Review Board about police misconduct. It got the school district to begin to address African-American history in a way it had never been before. But it all started by creating these interracial relationships in something they called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue. So there are many examples like this. It's the many that make it detailed. We didn't actually tell you much about how to organize a social at an ice cream picnic or anything like that.
There are a lot of opportunities in the book, and as we close, I'm given cause to think of one of my favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quotes, and I actually think most Martin Luther King Jr. quotes are actually pretty tired in this, the year of our Lord 2023, because people like to use them for whatever. But he does say, you don't need a college degree to serve. You don't need to make your subject and verb agree to serve. And in this book, I think you're going to find dozens of opportunities. Get started, find some people who are different than you, build a relationship, go from there. I think Alex is going to moderate some Q&A right now, so I'll pass it to him.
Yeah, happy to transition to Q&A. Before we get started there, can we just give a round of applause for Richard, Leah, and Izzy? So feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic. Chad.
Thank you all so much. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the recent U.S. Surgeon General's report on isolation and loneliness, calling it an epidemic in our society. And I really heard in your comments the importance of social capital, social connectedness to be able to mobilize. I know a little bit tongue in cheek, it doesn't go into the specifics of how to organize like an ice cream picnic. But my concern is maybe that's where our society is. Folks don't know how to organize block parties. They don't literally know the neighbors of the people that they've lived beside for 15, 20 years, never been in their homes, don't know who they are. Faith communities unable to take literally the commandment to love your neighbor. So I wonder if you could just chat a little bit about some of the state of the union in terms of our social capital, and are we actually diagnosing the problem at the level that it really is? If we're unable truly to mobilize at the grassroots, what are the impacts for this book?
I think we give a lot of examples of people who start very simply. They go door to door, they start talking to their neighbors, introduce themselves. And I don't think it takes a lot to know about organizing to just start doing that, just to start talking to people. And in relation to this book, and one of the reasons why we're isolated from each other is because we think we're so different. We live in different communities, our communities look different, we must be different. And I think once we start talking to each other, people in different race neighborhoods from different backgrounds, we see that we aren't actually that different. And it just takes starting to have some conversations. And, we hope to give some ideas about how to start those conversations, and then how to, what kinds of policies and strategies a group could advocate for or pressure their local government or local institutions to implement. And I concede, I get that there's a big step in the middle of how to organize, and this isn't an organizing manual. So once these groups are formed, they're going to need help from skilled organizers to help them learn how to advocate and how to create change in their communities. But that won't go anywhere if people aren't talking to each other and understanding that they have the same concerns about their own communities. I can try to be a quick example. I wrote about, we have a column on Substack that we're continuing to write about these issues and continuing to give like success stories and updates. You can find it there on Substack. But I just wrote about a story of a community in Silicon Valley in California that is very exclusive, very expensive community. You wouldn't think that there would be a lot of support for affordable housing. This is like, you know, the sort of what you would expect where NIMBYs would just be rife, the not in my backyard people who don't, you know, allow affordable housing to be built in their communities. But a group formed there when they started talking about the color of law and the pieces in that book that were about that region, and developed a workshop about how their own region came to be segregated, did it all around their region, educated people from Rotary clubs to school districts, and started to build a base for an organization of people who, in order to join the organization, had to agree with their values of inclusion and diversity and creating an inclusive community. And then a school district proposed to build some affordable housing for teachers on a vacant school site it owned, because teachers couldn't afford to live anywhere near where they taught. And some other residents opposed it and put a measure on the ballot to try to block this development and essentially block any future affordable housing in the city. And because this group had been talking to each other and developing some shared values around what they wanted their city to look like, they organized a campaign and defeated this measure. And they did it by going door to door and talking to every voter and talking to their neighbors and finding out that there were even more of them that agreed with making their community a more inclusive place. So it is possible.
I would also say that is a fantastic example, by the way. Two things real quick. I am sure that they sell a copy of Jane McAlevy's No Shortcuts somewhere in this building, if you are looking for an organizing manual. But I would recommend checking out pages 98 and 99 of Just Action, which, and no one take this personally, I'm not trying to start a fight right now. They sample from a pamphlet on becoming a conscientious gentrifier, which is actually 8 really specific steps that mostly involve getting to know your neighbors. Specific, simple things you can do to start off building a relationship. And so I would really recommend that folks start there for those. You go to a different church, go to a different corner store or bodega for that kind of like ground level tip.
Hi, I've been studying minority-owned banks for a while, helping some people, and in particular, Black-owned banks. And it's been depressing. There were about 40 in 2000. After the financial collapse, about 30. As of today, about 21. A guy named Junior Bridgman, who used to play for the Milwaukee Bucks, is preparing to invest $30 million in a new Black-owned bank in Milwaukee. And the question that raised for me was, if you were advising someone who was going to invest $30 million in the inner city of Milwaukee, is a bank the best thing you can do to help the community?
You were just in Milwaukee, weren't you?
Yesterday.
Well, one of the things that we emphasize over and over again is that there is no best thing to do. There are so many possible things to do that trying to find the best one is an excuse to do nothing. So I would never say to somebody that they shouldn't do something like that. But we need white-owned banks in low-income neighborhoods as well. One of the reasons why African Americans can't build up their credit scores the way whites can is there are no conventional financial institutions in many Black neighborhoods. And so I'm all in favor of having Black-owned banks, but the real issue is banks alone of any kind being in those neighborhoods. And that's the most serious problem we face. And we do have, again, examples of places where there are no such banks and where organized groups forced banks to make a concession. It's, we don't go into a lot of detail about this, but there is a federal law that requires banks, it's unenforced, requires banks to serve all income areas, all income level areas in their broader service area. Most banks don't. Most banks take deposits in Black neighborhoods, if they have there at all, and make loans in white neighborhoods with those deposits. That's a violation of the Community Reinvestment Act. But unless there's an activist group that's going to challenge that bank's practices, they'll continue to do it. And
Hi, thank you so much for writing these books and doing the work that you're doing. I just had a question. I know a lot of times in the BIPOC community, we talk about the poverty mindset, especially in one who's really wanting to buy a home. And I know me and my husband, we were really excited. And then I think, you know, when everything had transpired, I was like, I just don't want to deal with that about buying a home, going in and having to prove myself to be able to do that. But my husband, who grew up in a different area than I did, he was like, I just don't think it's attainable. He was like, because I never grew up in a home where I did. And so, like, how do we help those who have that mindset to be able to get past the barrier, to be able to, you know, feel that freedom in being a homeowner? I know a lot of times we think about the American dream, but for our community, as you stated numerous times, we can't get that, right? Or we have to work 10 or 20 times harder just to say, yes, I have a good job, or yes, I have this. I know me being a state employee, that's the first thing that I say when I walk in. And then the whole idea of me changes, right? Like, oh, you work for the state? Oh, come on in. And so, like, how do we help people shift within that poverty mindset?
Yeah, well, throughout the book, we talk about having race-specific solutions and race-specific remedies, and that speaks to your question. We have an example in the book. We talk about homeownership education and counseling programs that help first-time homeowners kind of learn the ins and outs of home buying. And those are generally sort of open to the public, to people getting grants or certain kinds of mortgages. They have to take these classes. So we talk about a group in Portland that offered this class and found that even though African Americans made up a large portion of those eligible for their programs, they weren't completing the courses and they weren't being successful in buying homes. So they developed a course specifically taught by and for African Americans that addressed a lot of the issues that you talked about, their family backgrounds, the specific sort of beliefs about home ownership that African Americans have. And it was hugely successful in terms of the participants who then went on to purchase homes. And they also got to meet other Black homeowners in their neighborhood and developed a network of support. So that's just another example of why not every remedy will help African Americans the same as everyone else. And so we need all of our remedies in order to be a tool to redress segregation, to be specifically tailored for and targeted for African Americans.
And I think I'm going to make it personal again. The thing, how do I want to say this? I'm just going to say it. Talking about race-specific remedies and talking about expropriation of wealth from African American communities that is ongoing today is something that you discuss as a part of a pattern of a history. You make a good example of contract sales, a thing that I just want to make folks aware of that happens, and overwhelmingly now in African American and Latinx communities, where there may be generational homes, but where folks are dealing with these wealth and income gaps. If you are behind on your property taxes or behind on your water bill, that is public information. There are companies that will write to know those lists from your municipalities, and then they will flood those homes, those phone numbers, those neighborhoods with the "we buy houses" cash kind of calls and signs and whatnot. And they use this specifically to expropriate wealth from low-income homeowners and then, you know, move it into their own hands for profit. And so absolutely, I want us to be thinking not just in the space of coming out of a space where there have been, as you put it, Richard, race-specific crimes, but an ongoing expropriation of wealth from our communities that we need to push back against. Where did Alex get upstairs? Or yeah, okay, you had it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So hello. Thank you all for coming. My question, I'm a dad. My daughter and I, we got into a space of hosting community events together, right? So there was something that sparked that. There was a catalyst. So you two, like obviously you've been in this work for decades now, Leah. And I would like to say that Dad's proud, right? And Dad would probably like to say, I had something to do with that, right? Was there a moment where you were able to look up to Dad, or Dad, was there a moment where you were able to look down to Leah and say, hey, like, how do you put it into the sense of a child? Because you've been doing this work for a while. It didn't just pop up. So I'd like to know at all, if you can remember that moment that provided that spark.
I don't think there was a moment. I grew up from birth with parents who were activists. So it was in my blood and it was all I knew. I remember the moments when I realized that wasn't normal, actually, like the opposite, that most kids didn't do their homework in the back of city council meetings and, on picket lines. But I think it was just how we understood our place in the world as a family, which is that we have a role to play in making the world better. So I don't know that there was a moment, unless you remember something I don't.
Every moment. No, thank you for that question. I am very proud.
Any other questions from our audience?
Do you have some concerns in some states where there are a huge number of companies building homes just for rent, and it appears to be in areas where there are more diverse and keeping people out of home ownership by building entire developments that are owned entirely by a company that only plans to rent them?
Well, I don't think they keep people out of home ownership, but it is a problem because what the other aspect of what you're talking about is these companies are raising rents far beyond, because they're a monopoly, far beyond what the market should be requiring. And that's one of the biggest problems of these companies is, as Leah said, home ownership is one solution. We're not opposed to renters. In fact, we have many programs in the book that we describe to protect renters. But if the supply of housing for rentals declines, those policies and programs are less powerful.
There is another policy idea is inclusionary zoning, which is where it's adopted through a city or county jurisdiction zoning code. So up to the local government. And it says that when new housing developments are built, a certain percentage of the units have to be sold or rented at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. So that's a way to address when a lot of development is happening in a neighborhood that's market rate and raising the rents of the entire neighborhood and displacing residents. That's something to advocate for that can help prevent some of that displacement by making sure some of the new development is affordable. And then putting preferences on those units so African Americans can get into them.
I'll piggyback off of that specifically because something that you do spend some time on in the book, just to shorthand it, is warning folks to be careful not to essentially ghettoize folks in affordable and low income housing, that it is important that come to be in depressed communities, rapidly gentrifying communities, but also those high opportunity zones. Tell us briefly, and sorry to hijack, but tell us briefly why that's so important from your perspective.
Sure, we place great emphasis in this book on the fact that there's a terrible stereotype, not just in ordinary white people, but among policymakers, that somehow Black and poor are the same thing. The reality is that most African Americans are not poor. Most are working class, middle class families who, because of centuries of discrimination, unconstitutional policies, have less access to opportunity than similar middle class and working class whites. For example, we have a federal subsidy. We talked about it a lot this evening, the Section 8 program for low-income people. People who can afford, richer people who can afford market rate housing can afford to buy it without subsidy. But people between those two also cannot afford housing, and there's no subsidy for them, even though the reason they cannot afford it is a history of unconstitutional policy that needs to be remedied. So at this point, we don't have any faith that federal policy is going to change in significant ways to redress segregation. But there are lots of local policies that can change if people are mobilized at a local level to do it. We talk about a program in Massachusetts, for example, which is a specific subsidy for this missing middle. And we profile in Just Action a rental development which has indistinguishable units, architecturally indistinguishable in appliances, some for Section 8 voucher holders, some for this missing middle with a mild subsidy from the state program, and some for market rate families who can afford to rent without any subsidy. And we describe the social interactions that exist in this community of people of different income levels, not just the poorest and the richest, but people in between as well. And there's a photograph in the book about what they call a paint night, of an artist who comes and gives a class on how to paint landscapes. And you can see people of different races, well, blacks and whites. And when I interviewed many of them, and I asked them, well, this person, which kind of unit is she in or he in? Is it a market rate unit, a middle income unit, or they didn't know. People didn't know what kinds of incomes and subsidies they have. Well, that's a state program. Those kinds of subsidies can also be provided locally by local government if it's really seriously committed to having a healthy society. Mixing just the very poor and just the very rich in single developments without anybody in the middle is not a healthy model for housing. And we think that that's another target of local committees, local activists, to insist that their community find ways of also including the missing middle.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. It's been very, very interesting. This is perhaps more of a comment, but I'll be interested to see if you have a response. I'm a part of a social justice group in my church, which happens to be Presbyterian. And our pastor does a great job of working across racial churches, and we include Muslims. But at any rate, in the last couple of years, we've read a number of books on different areas of social justice. The book we just finished, which I highly recommend, is Poorly Understood. Are you familiar with that? I'll have to look on my phone, tell you the name of it. But it talks about the myths of poverty and all of the ideas that it's the poor, it's the Blacks who are poor. It's an excellent book on helping to understand poverty and racism. But we finish each of our books by saying, now what do we do? It seems as though we want to have something done right away. And then we say to each other, maybe to make ourselves feel better, well, you know, it took a long time to get here. It's going to take a long time to fix things. And we have to start small. So I'm looking forward to seeing the comments in your book, the suggestions and ideas, which I think will make our group feel better, that we can have some ideas for some small steps, because it is discouraging to talk about the problems and then not be able to figure out how to fix them because they seem so governmentally, politically driven. So anyway, I don't know what you have to say about that, but it's a frustrating thing to study this and then not kind of know where to go next.
Yeah, I completely understand. And that's exactly why we wrote this book, to help us all have an idea of what we can do next and how we can get started. And it's, we talk about all of the many examples we give, and we're not saying any of them are necessarily easy. None of the big changes we've seen, social movements have been, overnight or easily won, but they take, slow, methodical work. And all of the strategies in our book are attainable, and we give examples of communities doing them all over the country and successfully. So I hope it gives your group some ideas of what to do next.
Can we give one more round of applause for I just have a couple quick notes. One, just another thank you to Representative Smith-Waite-El for joining us this evening. It was really tremendous. My second note is I started the bookstore about 7 years ago. We've had new books for about 6. This book is the best-selling book in the history of the bookstore. So congratulations to Richard. So as far as next steps, we have a book signing over here with Richard and Leah. We have books available for purchase up the cafe. We have both The Color of Law and Just Action. And just a quick note that we technically are closing. So feel free to browse for a little bit, but we'll be closing.